Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon to this event, How to Ensure a Zero Carbon Future. I'm not Kevin Watkins, as you might have twigged. Kevin has had to go to another meeting, but we're hoping very shortly he'll join us and take part in the panel at the end. Just by way of introduction, I wanted to kind of reflect a little bit as the Director of Communications at ODI on the topic here, a zero carbon future. I think to most ordinary people out there, the idea of zero net emissions to many seems unimaginable and quite unrealistic. But I think one of the things that we also have to keep reiterating is also unimaginable is the consequences of what happens if we don't get there. So the question really is, how do we get there? And one of the things that I like that you say in this briefing report, Stefan, is that you say someone has to start. And I think this report and other work, some of which has been done here at ODI and by the New Climate Economy Group, is really beginning to map how we get there and how we make this idea, this unimaginable idea, really a reality. And for ODI, our interest in it as well is the question for us is how do the developing world countries get there? And how can they get there without jeopardizing that vital goal of lifting so many of their citizens out of poverty? So I think some of those themes will pick up in our discussion in a little bit. But just to introduce the panel, here to discuss this new World Bank report is Stefan, I'm just looking for your Algat, and you're a senior economist at the Climate Change Group at the World Bank, and you've published many articles on green growth and climate. Amali Amin is an associate director of E3G, and you lead their program on international climate finance, and you also helped set up the UK's Green Investment Fund. Ilmi Granov is ODI's own. He leads on green growth here at ODI, many of you will know. And prior to that, advised the African Development Bank as their Environment and Climate Council. And also well known to many of you, I'm sure, is Michael Jacobs, sitting at the end there, senior advisor to the New Climate Economy Project, an economist, a political scientist, and between 2007 and 2010, an advisor to the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown. So really bringing that kind of hard political perspective to some of these debates. So the way we're going to run this is first Stefan is going to present really what his key findings are in this report, and that'll take about 15 minutes. And then Amal will respond, and then Ilmi and Michael will chip in with some questions. But then we'll open it up to you to also ask questions. So I hope you prepare some questions and we have a really lively and engaged session. And also we'll have an online audience, and if they want to ask questions, I've got an iPad here and I will take the questions from all over the world as well. So handing over to you, Stefan, for your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for organizing this event and for attending. It's a very busy year in the domain, and everybody has a lot to do, so we really appreciate that you're taking the time for organizing and attending. The weather is not so nice, so this is not a competition, but I will just try to go very briefly through this report. We have many different products. We have the thick version, which is almost 200-page report. We have the overview, the 20-page document, and we have 3 policy notes focusing on the 3 big topics that are 4 pages. So we adjust to the level of time and effort that you're ready to dedicate to looking into this. But we really hope that the full report is really bringing all the evidence and all the scientific basis for what we say in the very short version. It's not just that we're saying what we think should happen, but we have a lot of work to back this work. So let me just say a little bit about why we started to do this. And it was motivated by 3 issues. The first one is everybody's talking about 2 degrees and the target, but I wasn't sure people really understood what it meant, and this question of decarbonization is really important, so I'm glad you picked it up, and I'll come back to it in just a minute. The second thing is looking at what the World Bank and many others are doing in developing countries in terms of planning. There is really this focus on the medium term, like 2030, 2035. But we felt that we really lack the long-term view, which is also important for the planning. And the third point was everybody is really focused at the moment on carbon pricing and financial instruments. We really wanted to push this idea that we're talking about a policy package and to really stress the importance of the political economy of the reform, which is linked to this package. So these are the three things that we wanted to really discuss. But the first, and maybe main point, is this thing which is in IPCC report still 91, basically, and which is maybe the major output of the climate science, which is if you want to stabilize the climate, you need to bring especially CO2 emissions to zero. And we really felt that this was not enough in the policy discussion. When we have all the indices for the Paris negotiation arriving at the moment, everybody is making sums of commitment for 2030. It's important, we have to look at that, but there is not much discussion about whether this is creating a credible pathway to zero emission, which we felt is a really important question too. So, I mean, I guess you know this, figure which is taken out of the IPCC showing the quasi-linear relationship between all the CO2 emissions that we're doing since 1870 up to 2100, and on the y-axis, the temperature change. So in spite of the huge complexity of the problem and all the nonlinear things that are taking place in the climate system, in the end, we have a very simple result. That temperature change is just linearly related to the total emissions accumulated over time. And it means that if you want to stabilize at 2 degrees, you have, I mean, there is an uncertainty, but you have a budget in terms of CO2 emission. But if you don't want to do 2 degrees and you want to do 3, you have a budget. And if you want 4, you have a budget. And so the fact that we need zero emission at one point is disconnected from the target. So this is a very robust finding that we can start to plan from. And we have a lot of discussion about how this is risk management and how there are a lot of uncertainty and surprises and so on. But there are things we know, and some of them are very robust, and this is one of them. So we can use this very robust finding to help design policies. So the future is carbon-free, and we really started from that point. And then we looked at 3 steps to get there. So the idea of having steps is directly inspired by the best-selling books in the world market, which is only like 3 steps to do something, to lose 20 pounds or to get a great job and something. So hopefully we'll get great sale numbers because of this. The 3 steps are first the planning, and our point in there is the planning should start with the end goal. You start from where you want to be, and then you work backwards to see what you need to do now. Second point is about this policy package that we need and stressing the needs for more than just carbon pricing. And finally, and maybe the most important, the political economy and the impact on the poor. So let me just go quickly through this. So first, in terms of the planning, I told you that we need zero emissions. What's interesting is, depending on what you want to do, the timing is not that different. So you have the first big plume are the baselines in terms of CO2 emissions between 2000 and the end of the century. The kind of pinkish plume is the 2 degree, and the bluish one is the 3 degree. So, I mean, we need basically to bring CO2 emissions to zero around the end of this century for any reasonable target that we might have. So the debate on the 2 degree target can be completely disconnected from what we want to do now. For many people, and you said that, it's overambitious and we'll never be able to get it. And to be honest, a year ago, people were laughing at me at the World Bank when I was talking about full decarbonization. Hopefully this will change. So you're laughing also. The good news is that if you look at all the work done on this field, there is a huge consensus. And basically, we know how to get there. And it's based on 4 different things we need to do. First one is zero carbon electricity. Second one is fuel shifting in end-use sectors, moving to lower carbon intensity fuels, and in the end, to this decarbonized electricity that we produce. Third one is energy efficiency, because we will never do the 2 first pillars without energy efficiency. And the last one is managing land use to make sure ecosystems are sinks of carbon and not sources. And what's really important is we need to do the 4 things to get to zero emission. You cannot miss one of those. And one of the fear we have with targets and plans that are looking only at 2030 is that if you want to reduce emissions by 20% or 30% by 2030, you don't need these 4 pillars. So you can select the cheapest cost options and basically get to minus 20 or minus 30% of emissions with just marginal changes and not starting to do the structural change that you need to get there. And we propose ideas to make sure the short-term planning takes into account the fact that we need to start now with the structural change we need to get to zero emissions. And we suggest that this is a busy slide, but that this should be based on sectoral indicators to check that we're doing what needs to happen in the 4 pillars. So decarbonization, efficiency, fuel shifting, and sinks. For these 4 things, we can develop sectoral indicators to make sure that how we do the reduction by 2030 is creating the foundation we need to get to zero emission, and not only done through marginal changes that will not get us there. So there are many, many ways of doing minus 20% emission reduction in 2030. Some of them are marginal and don't help us get to zero emission. Some others really build these foundations we need. We think that beyond the numbers, the economy-wide numbers, we need to check that what we're doing over the short term is really going in that direction. So, and we want to talk about low-income environments, so we have also a lot of discussion about all the co-benefits of doing that, linked to congestion in cities or to air pollution. This is Beijing, as you might have guessed. So in many countries, there are very good reasons to do that anyway, even if you're not interested in the climate question. The second step is to create policies to do this. And we're starting, like everybody else, with the carbon pricing, but we try to give it a slightly different point of view by stating the fact that carbon pricing and energy taxes are just good fiscal policies for countries that want to raise revenues. And it's much better and much more efficient than a lot of the taxes that we have actually in place. And in low-income environments where there are very huge issues to raise taxes, and in Africa, a lot of countries have 10 or 20% of GDP in tax revenues, which is just not enough to finance infrastructure development and social protection. Looking at energy taxes can be a very good solution. And one reason, which is, I think, a new discussion, is about tax evasion, which is a big problem in developing countries. But looking at the UK, these are the tax evasion for 3 types of taxes: corporate tax, VAT, and income taxes, and for the tax on diesel. And clearly, it's much easier if you have weak institutions, or even solid ones, to tax energy and fossil fuels, just because cheating on this is much more complicated. You have to move things around, which is more difficult than moving your money to some island in the Caribbean. So in a lot of low-income countries, with problems to raise taxes and a lot of problems with a large share of the economy in the informal sector, which means that each time you raise taxes on income and corporate taxes, you create an incentive to stay informal, and this is bad for development. We think that this could be a very good idea. And a lot of people are saying carbon pricing is great, but only for countries at middle income and high income level. I think purely fiscal reasons make a carbon tax a good idea for low income countries too. So the carbon pricing might not be only something you want for if you're rich enough. And I'll get back to the distributional issues at the end. A lot of people are saying that a carbon tax is not a good idea because it destroys its own tax base. But this doesn't make sense because an efficient carbon tax has to be growing over time. The dollar per ton that you need to put in place has to be growing over time. So even if the amount of emissions are growing, in all models, we find that the income that's raised by a carbon tax is fairly stable or increasing over time. Then we really stress the need to go beyond prices. And we propose this kind of like screening tool to think about what needs to happen. First, you need to look at the incentive. Do people have an incentive to reduce emissions? And the carbon pricing will play a key role into creating these incentives. But it does not always work. For instance, you can create an incentive, but if the law is not enforced, like it was in Brazil for deforestation before like 10 years ago, basically it doesn't work. So even in terms of incentive, you have to go beyond just the pricing issue and think about many other issues. But then, even if the incentive is right, we know that when we have to make sure the information is distributed, then we have to make sure we don't have problems with behaviors, like preference for status quo, which means that bringing a new price might not solve all problems. And then we have to go to the resource assessment and look at whether capital markets and financial flows can make it possible for people to respond to these incentives they have. And for each of these blocks, we're making proposals in terms of policies. So in some cases, if you're looking at energy efficiency in buildings, for instance, the problem is not so much a problem of incentives. It's a problem of information, behavior, and resource. So the solutions will be very different from cases where the incentive is wrong. So we discuss, I won't get into the details, but we discuss the policy package that it means with developing the technologies, act on new investments with especially performance standards, which are very efficient for in many sectors, develop the right infrastructure, and we discuss the financial implications of this, and all the question of information and right behaviors. I use this figure because a carbon tax will never make someone doing this change his or her behavior. At one point, you have like social norms have to change to make sure energy is not wasted anymore. And this is a picture taken in the US, of course. It's a poster child of inefficient energy use. But if you look at many countries at the moment, I mean, you can make very similar claims. So now let me get to my third step, the political economy and the transition for those who are affected. The communication people asked us not to use the word losers. So I will do my best not to use the word like losers from the policies. It's the people who stand to be most affected. But basically it's the same thing. Basically what we want is really to protect the people losing, because that's the only way things will get done. We have many examples of cases where the efficiency of the climate policy is really not the question. Nobody cares if the policy is really efficient. The question is what the political economy, who is winning, who is losing, what are the groups promoting and supporting the policy. And this is really something that we have to take into account from day one in the design of policy packages. It's not like the secondary thing at the end, you think, oh, I have some losers from my policy and I need to compensate them. We claim that this should be the starting point of the discussion. One of the very important things is the question of the value of the polluting assets. And clearly, if you just bought this fancy car, brand new coal power plant, or this house, you will be pushing against the carbon pricing and any form of climate policies that make the value of your investments or the benefit you get out of it to be reduced. And it really means that in the process, the maybe 10, 20, 30 years that it will take to put in place carbon pricing everywhere, the first priority is to slow down the building up of assets which are carbon dependent. And there are many ways of doing that. Performance standards are very efficient to do this. We saw it for cars. Urban planning is also important because a lot of the assets people own are their home. So we need to make sure the new buildings are not dependent on carbon fuels. But it's also the financing environment. And we're discussing a lot of financial tools, the green bonds and the fund that the UNFCCC is creating and so on. But there is also this big question about the financial sector as a whole and whether the way risks are assessed, for instance, in the financial system, take into account this type of risk. So we're making a few points on that. And finally, about poverty, when you're looking at the political economy, there are really two different issues. One is you want to protect poor people and vulnerable people because that's the right thing to do. And sometimes you need to just buy out some interest groups because otherwise you cannot implement any policy. I think we have to make this difference. Sometimes you're compensating people who might not deserve it, but it's just the only way forward and you have to do it. But one thing is clear, these policies will be successful over the long term only if they contribute to poverty eradication and development. So getting back to my discussion on carbon pricing, we're very open and I mean, every country will decide to go for a tax or to go for a cap and trade and so on. But there is one thing we're saying very strongly is whatever you do, it has to raise revenues, because that's how you ensure that carbon pricing contributes to development, either through reducing other taxes, maybe in developed countries, or helping to develop and to bring the infrastructure that developing countries have so much trouble to finance. So electricity grids, water infrastructure, urban development, all of that really requires new resources, and this could contribute to it. But also we need to be very pragmatic. So this is a picture of cook stoves, and we have some good studies from India, for instance, showing that if you remove fossil fuel subsidies without looking twice, what you will do is you will stuck poor people using biomass instead of moving to gas. And this is fairly terrible for development, for health, for gender balance, for many, many reasons. If you decide that you keep the subsidy on LPG in rural areas, the impact on emissions is 0, and you avoid a negative impact on the poorest. So this is probably the right way to go. So even if we make all these claims about fossil fuel subsidies and so on, we also call for being pragmatic in how it's implemented, how policies are sequenced, just to make sure we don't create negative impacts which first we don't want, and second will backfire, and the entire thing might just be destroyed if it can be showed that it has a negative impact on the move of poor people toward modern energy. So people will need to be very pragmatic and context-specific and to implement policies that maybe don't reduce emissions as much as we could, but protect the poorest. And one way of doing that, we say, is to transform these subsidies into just cash transfers. So these numbers are what happens if you remove $100 of fossil fuel subsidies in a group of 22 developing countries, and you give the same amount of money to everybody in the country. If you do this, rich people, it's a minus $23, are losing because they consume a lot of energy, so on balance they lose. And poor people, because they consume less energy, are net winners. And this is a reform that you can do in any country because it's very easy to do. You don't need a fancy registry of social protection beneficiaries and so on. You just replace by a cash transfer. So the point we're making is we have to recognize that fossil fuel subsidies and low energy prices are helping the poor. This is a fact. Just a very inefficient way of doing it. So what we want is not to remove it. We just want to replace these tools by more efficient tools to help the poor better. And if I may, one thing, in terms of recognizing the right of poor people, helping them by giving them money and telling them, do what you want with this money, is recognizing their free will much more than telling them, we'll help you, but to buy energy. Don't buy anything else. So it's not only more efficient, it's also, in terms of rights and freedom, something that I think we should prefer. And that's my last point. So we can go to the discussion. In terms of how to build the support from these interest groups that in many cases are opposing the reform at the moment, we make two sets of recommendations. First is identify the interest groups which are against you and try to make them benefit from the change. So automakers were opponents and are moving towards supporters because they realize that electric cars can be a good deal for them. Maybe we can do the same with oil and gas industry by making them benefiting from the change, for instance, with carbon capture and sequestration. And we also say that pilot projects will play a key role in this process of transforming our economies. If we can put the pilot projects in places which are affected negatively because one industry is suffering, well, it creates a benefit in the region that might increase the support. And it's really important to avoid concentrated losses across the population and across time. And we're looking at different experience from structural change in the past and from trade liberalization, which are also big shocks to economies. What we find is in countries with very strong social protection, you might not need to do something special. So if you live in Sweden, you're fairly well protected against structural change, and that might be enough. If you live in a country where you don't have that, then dedicated instruments might be very important. We look at what Japan did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as they were trying to promote the transformation of the economy from a traditional to a modern economy. A lot of the subsidies were going to textile industry. So a lot of the subsidies were going to the sectors which were disappearing to make sure this disappearance could be slow enough for the sectors to adjust and avoid the big shock that would create a backlash against the entire change. Similarly, after the oil shock, the Japan government created a system to downsize some industries, including shipbuilding, to make sure the timing was right and the downsizing went with modernization and not just a harsh competition downsizing. And finally, we discuss worker retraining, which we have many examples of how to support workers who lost their job from trade liberalization and how to help them find another one. And there is a lot of things that we can get use, a lot of lessons from this. And one lesson is what seems to have worked best is to subsidize employment in the winning sectors after trade liberalization. So maybe that's also an idea in countries with weak safety net, subsidizing employment in sectors which are not very intensive in emissions might be a good solution to minimize the impact on workers. So as I said, much more in the report itself, and happy to have a conversation about these findings. One of the things we discussed before starting is because we're all producing reports and we want all to say that this is new and this is different and so on, we don't stress enough the fact that a lot of us are saying fairly the same thing in different ways and with different emphasis, but the main message is very similar. So that's maybe one thing that we can discuss. How do we make sure that we get interest on our report and some people read them, but still we make it very clear that there are a lot of things we know on how to do this and how to do this well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I notice, although it's 3 steps to a zero carbon future, it's not 3 easy steps. And I think you laid out a really clear framework, but, you know, there's a lot of heavy lifting in there as well, isn't there? Just one quick question before we go to Amal. You know, you also heavily involved the World Bank with drawing up the INDCs, especially in the developing countries. Just thinking a little bit about what you sketched out, what needs to happen there. How far away do you think that those countries are really engaging with this agenda?
So the really good news is it seems that the INDCs that were proposed up to now are not only looking at the very short term. They all have a dimension about, an indication of what the target is for 2050, which is really going in the direction we want, which is for Paris to send the signal that we're starting the big transition, that this is credible, and that it's a good idea to invest in it. So the signaling impact of these long-term indicative targets, which are not commitments, I think is very positive. In terms of the policy commitment, so in INDCs you have the short-term, so 2025 or 2030 commitment in terms of emissions, and countries are reporting on the policies they think they will implement to get there. And that's, I think, where a lot of work remains to be done to create packages which are comprehensive enough and are really covering all these dimensions that I discussed. Only if the policy package, which again is not a commitment but is building the credibility of the NDC, only if this package is looking credible and realistic, we will be able to believe that these NDCs are more than just like negotiation positions, but really projects for the countries.
Okay, great, and maybe that's something we can come back to later in the discussion. Amal, do you want to just give us some responses to Stefan's ideas there?
Thank you. Yes. I haven't read the full report. I've just read the overview very quickly before this session, actually. But so thank you very much for the presentation. That really has helped me understand much better. And I think I really very much agree with pretty much everything you said. I would like to, maybe it will be a point for discussion, come back to one of the last points around providing subsidies to ensure that some of the potential losers remain winners, if you like, because I think that brings with it new challenges as well, which I'll come back to. But I think overall, I think it's excellent the way you've managed to articulate the point about the long-term goal being key. A lot of my work at E3G, we focus very much on looking at how to promote financing, including long-term finance. Focus very much on discussions around investment grade policy, basically how to accelerate the participation of institutional investors into the low carbon economy. And the long-term goal is now, as we're seeing coming up very much in the build-up to Paris, a long-term goal is seen as absolutely key to that. So it is important for an investor perspective. But I very much like the way, and obviously coming from the World Bank, the way you've also made clear that that is also about ensuring development benefits can be better delivered, as well as the most affordable options being taken. Because I think that's the point. When you said it kind of sort of point, I guess I knew, but it sort of made me think, okay, yeah, that's actually something we all need to be reminded of, is that there are a lot of options that may be quite low cost that we think, well, this is the way to do it. Let's get started on the easy investments, easy policies, etc. But actually, and and dare I say it, I think the whole carbon pricing agenda has sort of fallen a little bit. We all collectively perhaps put too much hope on carbon markets and carbon pricing as delivering not just those easy, low-hanging options, but actually we thought it would go beyond to deliver the more difficult, more transformational investments. And I think that has not proven to be the case. So I think that's not to say carbon pricing, it does not have an important role. I think it does, but it clearly, as you say very well in the report, we need to go beyond that, because carbon pricing may deliver some of that more low-hanging fruit. The higher the price goes, the more of the sort of higher hanging fruit you might go for. But in reality, there are many other types of barriers to investment, some of which may be behavioural, others may be more structural, which I don't believe carbon pricing can really grapple. And so I very much like the fact you bring that message very clearly into your report. I think also important to recognise that carbon pricing can be most effective when the revenues are directed to the low carbon economy. Of course, that's not proven to be the case in many countries. I think Germany have allocated a certain amount both to domestic and international agenda in terms of revenues. In other countries, that's happened partially, often implicitly and not explicitly. And I think bringing that more clearly out, I think, is an important contribution to the debate. As I said, I think I like the fact you talk about long-term goal, but also that you recognise very, very clearly that this is about credible pathways that take place at the national level, and those pathways will all differ depending on the circumstances of that country, the natural resource availability or constraints, the fiscal, financial situation, whether you're middle income and low income countries will likely take very different pathways, but that all countries are embarking on this path to zero net emissions. And I think that very much is what the INDC debate and discussions leading up to and beyond Paris are very much need to recognise, because I think we're likely to be disappointed by the INDC's level of ambition that comes forward pre-Paris. But I think having them come forward and getting a certain amount of transparency around what countries are thinking about, that provides the basis for then working with countries, particularly those middle-income countries that may think they can go beyond what is feasible, but yet they don't have that confidence yet. And actually, it may be beyond Paris. That's when you can really ratchet up the level of ambition. And so Paris is not the end point. In a way, I personally think, when the hard work really, really begins. I mean, we in E3G, and my colleagues Gabby and Paola are here, actually. We're working with Mexico, Chile, and also Colombia in a slightly different context, to look at how to finance the INDCs now, and working with those governments to understand what some of the opportunities may be, but also where they may need to go, may need international finance to go beyond what they're currently thinking. But also a very much important part of that is how much private sector investment will be mobilised. domestic as well as attracting international. And I think that's really where these INDCs and the points you make about having a credible policy package, which will differ on a country-by-country basis, and within the country by sector basis, actually. That's what I think all governments now, alongside their private sectors, are having to really grapple with. So I think having some clarity around that this is the challenge, but it will be very differentiated and will require not insignificant amount of effort by policymakers, I think is valuable. I just wanted, because I'm sure I've gone over my 5 minutes, I put this here to see, yes I have, but I would like to, just the point I wanted to say about, and I guess I'll give a very brief anecdote around, it relates to the point you made about the fact that the poorest people often get given energy subsidies. At the same time, countries like Japan, they may subsidise the textile industry because, you know, that was seen as a good transitional policy or fiscal measure. I looked in some years ago now, but in a lot of detail at the Indian electricity sector, the Indian power sector. Now, those subsidies for the energy sector, they're not really benefiting the poor. Mm-hmm. They are primarily going to large agriculturalists in those regions, in those states where they've most industrialised most, actually. And so the sort of very inefficient use of subsidies there is not a pro-poor measure. It's actually benefited a sector that probably didn't want to see industrialisation coming forward. I would argue it has absolutely crippled parts of the Indian economy, and I think many would agree the lack of infrastructure, particularly the energy sector, is a major problem. So I think I agree we need to be looking at how to manage the transition, I mean, of course, and I think that does require, in some cases, use of subsidies. I think we need to be more smart about that, targeted, and think more carefully about how to encourage those sectors to better transition. So, for example, to subsidise carbon capture and storage could be a useful technology to help a particular sector transition out. But we need to avoid a situation where you just provide a blanket subsidy, which then promotes all sorts of inefficiencies and problems further down the line.
That's great. Thank you, Amal. And just quickly on this financing piece, you talked about mobilising the private sector. I mean, what kind of measures are underway to do that?
Well, I think it depends on the sector, on the country, but I think countries are taking very different types of approaches. I think my sort of general feeling is that countries should be looking at a combination of measures and applying those in a way that best overcomes identified barriers to investment. And that will be very specific, actually. So, for example, renewable energy goals may be best delivered through a feed-in tariff. It may be, though, if you want to bring in a renewable energy technology that is more expensive, that a feed-in tariff may not be the most appropriate policy or measure initially, and you actually do need to provide some sort of targeted use of public finance. And this is part of why, and this was very much the work I did, I was in DEC at the time on the UK's Green Investment Bank, where we saw that the renewables obligation was probably sufficient to deliver onshore wind, was sufficient to deliver a certain amount of offshore wind, and other technologies that were already commercially competitive or very near so. But for going into the levels, the scale and the amount of offshore wind that the UK needed, rather than just increasing the number of renewable certificates that would be provided as an incentive, it made more sense, both economically and financially, to actually provide some targeted public support to overcome very specific barriers. I mean, I can talk about that in more detail later.
Good. Okay, Ilmi, you have been doing some work on zero emissions, zero poverty for ODI. Do you find yourself on very similar ground here?
Yeah, I think where Stefan concluded is exactly right, which is we should be marching to the beat of the same drum, and I think there are a lot of synergies between this. In a way, it's I would almost see our work on zero as a commentary to this larger question that you've identified in a way, which is clearly, the scientific evidence gives us at the outermost reaches the need to get to zero net emissions by the end of the century, and there are certainly plausible scenarios in which we would need to do it much sooner. But we've already all agreed on 2 degrees in Copenhagen internationally, and so we've already set this goal essentially of zero net emissions before the end of the century. We also have a really important goal around poverty eradication, and making sense of that as a subset of the question of zero carbon development, I think is really important. And in fact, there's some concrete elements that answer that question in this report that we will draw from as we go forward, in showing, for example, that a lot of carbon reducing measures, including carbon pricing, are fiscal opportunities to address poverty and inequality, and are useful tools in that. A lot of reforms, such as the continued negative price we have on carbon in the form of energy and in the form of fossil fuel subsidies, if we can even get that negative price out of the way, that frees up fiscal resources that can benefit reductions in inequality and poverty. So I think there's some really good concrete examples in here that are really useful. I think the underlying point that we both share is that even though 2100 sounds incredibly far off, there are very immediate consequences in the near term about what that means. I mean, to cite 2 in the paper that I thought were very concrete and therefore important, we're talking about decarbonization of electricity by 2050. The life cycle of a lot of energy assets would include energy assets we build now. So 2050, from the perspective of a power plant, is what we build now. We're talking about carbon neutrality of agriculture and forestry by 2030. That really transforms how we conduct our land use now. There's a lot of political inertia. Even if we decided that we were 100% taking this serious by, say, for example, December of this year, just to pick a month out of the hat, there's policy inertia. So making that happen on the sort of 2020, 2025, 2030 timescale takes time. So this is all very present, and I think there's some good work in the paper that draws that out. I want to highlight 2 things that I thought were really particularly striking about the paper, implicit in the paper, that I found appealing, and then turn a question around for Stefan. One of the most remarkable things in here is that it has a subtle shift from theoretical economists to pragmatic economists. It is refreshing to hear a team of economists at the World Bank shift away from saying that we need a global carbon price, first and foremost, and that carbon prices are sufficient, and yet at the same time remind us how important carbon prices are. So the 2 places that they show up now are to say, yes, a carbon price is really important, but actually there's enough liquidity in regional and country markets that you can go ahead and put a carbon price, install a carbon price nationally, and it makes fiscal sense and it makes macroeconomic sense. And it doesn't hurt your competitiveness. The Scandinavians have had decades and decades of carbon pricing, and they're some of the most competitive economies in the world. And that equally, that it is not sufficient. We often hear economists explain why standards are such terrible ideas, and as a lawyer in a sea of economists, I try to remind my colleagues that actually sometimes those are incredibly efficient when you take into account political economy and technology forcing and some of the other factors that standards and regulations can do to drive change. So I found it really refreshing to hear that from economists. The question that I had is sort of a deeper sort of pair of questions is, I'm a little concerned that what this avoids is that a lot of the resistance to things like carbon taxes or deep decarbonization are about larger questions of political philosophy and the role and size of the government, and not just about the particular measure. I am American. So I know that the political discourse in my country is particularly anti-tax, but I do think that the context, what strikes me about these measures, whether it is social protection or the benefits of a new fiscal tool to raise revenue, are that things like infrastructure are at odds with austerity. And many of the issues that we're talking about are really ones that require a particular framework for thinking about the role of government in delivering public services and public goods. Can you do this on an effectively 13% tax rate, as many developing countries have? That's a really difficult question. Where we've seen it succeed has a pretty different model. So so I want to kind of challenge you to get into those questions as to what the implications of this for larger structural issues are.
That's your question.
Okay. So on this, and I think you raised that point a little bit too, the question of the. So first on the carbon pricing delivering the change, I think that's one of the thing we really wanted to clarify, that you can say, don't forget about performance standards, financial instruments, and so on, without saying we don't need a carbon price. That there is a room for a more subtle argument, which is not a very easy one. But in the end, the point we're trying to make is most of the discussion on carbon pricing, if you look at what happened in Europe, for instance, was basically increasing the cost of gasoline by like 5 to 10 cents. And if you're thinking about these 4 pillars that you want to achieve, there are things that this could change, but there are many that it cannot. I mean, and for transport, I don't see how a 5 to 10 cent difference in the gasoline price will achieve anything we're talking about in terms of decarbonizing individual vehicles, moving people to public transport, and so on. So for me, it's quite obvious that this is not enough in answering all questions. And I think there is a balance between the fact that you cannot, it's very difficult to push for 10 policy changes and 10 reforms at the same time. You want to be focused on a few things that matter. But at the same time, in that case, sorry, it's complicated. There is not just one solution, and we need to be a little bit more sophisticated. And I mean, on the performance standards, for instance, we have, a lot of experience of very effective policies that ex post we can measure the benefits from. And I think arriving from a theoretical perspective and saying this is stupid, we know better, discarding all this experience would not be like even like an objective approach. So I think it's being pragmatic, but it's also looking at the data. And if you look at the data, you reach the conclusion that if you want to reduce emissions from the buildings, and building norms is a fair starting point compared to a pricing approach. On the more difficult question, the one on the role of the state, I think this is not something that can be discussed.
Period.
No, I think it can, but my point is there is no general statement on this. If you're thinking of the US, it's clearly a very specific context with also a lot of reliance on fossil fuels. So it's also, if you're the mayor of Atlanta, reducing emissions is not an easy thing to do. You have all this heritage that you have to deal with. If you're looking at Europe, it's also a completely different story. And I think the question is more the financing of services rather than something about the taxes themselves. But I think in many contexts, you don't have the same problem. I think nobody would context the fact that Africa needs to raise more fiscal resources to finance development. I don't think this is a contentious issue. And I think at least to start with, we can, at least in these places, start from the situation today and say, maybe that's a question we want to revisit in 30 years. But between now and 30 years, I know that if I can raise 10 more points of GDP and finance drinking water, sanitation, and an electricity grid that makes sense, this is clearly contributing to development. And we don't have the same problem. I think there is another question when you start talking about complementary measures, is you're moving away from the climate discussion and you're talking much more about the role of the state and the voice of poor and non-poor people in a country. And clearly it makes the problem much more complicated because in many countries the poor don't have a voice. So it's interesting to see in fossil fuel subsidy reforms when you have all these upper middle class people saying you cannot remove them, it's bad for the poor, while they are the one losing for the reform. And in many cases, the poor are benefiting. So and the voice of the poor is used by whoever can use it for also personal interests. So this is, I think, maybe a bigger obstacle than the tax is okay or tax is not okay. And we saw there are many, many ways of not talking about taxes while implementing taxes, like contributions, fees, and either like, I mean, the Australian thing did not end up being implemented, but it was like a cap and trade without trade, with just a cap and a price that was fixed, so it was a tax basically. But so, and that's why on this we say that this must be designed at the country level, depending on the context and what words are acceptable or not in a given country, and it's very difficult in a global report to make precise recommendation on this. But I still think that energy taxes as a good fiscal policy is something that should work in many, many places. And even in the US, there are some discussions now, and I like this discussion because they are not starting from $1 per ton. So the discussion doesn't start by how many dollars per ton do I want to implement. The question is how much do I want to raise? And from how much do I want to raise, you can get to how many dollars per ton. And then you know what your carbon price will achieve. And then you can think about complementary policies you need to get to your climate goal. So this, in political economy terms, might be the right pathway towards a combination of carbon pricing and a bigger set of climate policies. And just to conclude on this, it's interesting that in the end, the countries really applying the regulatory approach to climate policies is the US, because it has been so difficult to get the discussion on the carbon pricing moving. So right now, the INDC of the US will be mostly based on performance standards and regulation. So, and they can get to the same point. So if that's the right starting point in a given context, so be it.
Great. Okay. Michael, a moment for you to kind of reflect on the report and also ask questions of Stefan. But one thing I'd be quite interested to hear in that as well is you're talking a lot about the political economy, to make this happen. Just, whether you feel we've paid enough attention to that political economy and how we get that moving to get the buy-in for some of these issues. I think would also be interesting to hear from you.
Well, let me come to that in a second. Let me just say in response to this, I grew up hating the World Bank, and for very good reasons, very good political and intellectual reasons. And it pains me in many ways to say that the World Bank has been leading over the last 5 years or so a really serious rethink about how development is undertaken in the context of climate change and in the context of wider environmental concerns. And Stefan's own work, personally, your work and the work of your team has made a huge contribution to this. The Green Growth report that you published 3 years ago, I think now, 2012, the Inclusive Green Growth report, which brought together a lot of your own thinking and so on, was a really important report. And the reason I want to say that is because I wanted to agree with you about the fact that we're all now producing a report. The New Climate Economy produced a big report last year. We got a lot of publicity for it. But we were absolutely clear in it, and I want to reiterate this was based on a lot of work which had been done by other institutions, and of which the World Bank is one, and Stefan's own work in particular. And what I think is most encouraging about this is that we're not writing brand new stuff. If we were writing brand new stuff, then it would take 10 years before it would become the consensus. And what we now have is an extraordinary consensus amongst all the leading international economic organizations in the World Bank, the IMF now, the OECD, all the other multilateral development banks, that it is possible to get low carbon and climate resilient growth. It's actually better growth, and that was why we, in the New Climate Economy Project, called our report Better Growth, Better Climate. And it can be achieved. And it's this consensus, actually, which gives me much more hope than the fact that we're producing original work. I don't want to produce original work. I want to produce work that belongs, that lots of other people agree with. And the World Bank, I think, has done extremely good work, and this is a useful addition to that. And its greatest use, let's not beat about the bush here. The World Bank is attaching itself to the long-term goal of reducing emissions to zero in the second half of the century. You are generous in your which IPCC scenarios that you allow before the end of the century, but as you notice, the bottom of the 2-degree one actually hits the zero in 2060. And there is, as Amalie says, a huge momentum now building around the inclusion of a long-term goal of getting emissions to zero in the second half of the century in the Paris Agreement. It'll be incredibly difficult to do this, but the movement around that and the fact that about 100 countries have now committed to this is a huge shift. Because it is setting a very clear, and not a vague sort of, not a temperature goal, but a very clear pathway for where emissions have to get to. And as you've said in this, I think so for the World Bank to be attaching itself to that, I think is really politically significant. And it does make it absolutely clear where we're headed. We're headed for the end of the carbon age. And, we know that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. The carbon age will not end because we're going to run out of carbon. That old environmental, that 1970s environmental argument that we're going to run out of these things is quite comprehensively wrong. And the shale gas revolution has shown just how much carbon there is in the world. We're going to end it because we can't cope with the environmental consequences. And that has got to be understood as where we're headed. And it's really great that the World Bank has attached itself to that core realization that that is where the world has got to head. And as you rightly say, it is now not laughable to say that because the technologies now clearly exist that would enable us to get there. And the big thing that economists find difficult, particularly in modelling, is understanding the pace of innovation that will help us to get there. Because although we have many of the technologies to do it, some of them are not yet at the right cost, but the innovation will get us there if we push it in that direction. And that's a really crucial finding. And for the economists, this, your emphasis that carbon pricing is important but not the whole thing is critical because pricing is a short-term instrument. Pricing gives you short-term changes. It doesn't give you structural change. And the way you have to get to zero is absolutely structural change. We have to take carbon out of the system. These are systems, industrial systems, built on carbon. Everything we've done has been built on carbon. To get it out, we have to make fundamental structural change, and that pricing just doesn't do that. Pricing is a short-term instrument which does switching of behaviours and where a fuel is a behaviour in power supply, but it doesn't give you structural change. What gives you structural change is infrastructure and the choice of infrastructure you make, and innovation. And it's those things which are the most crucial policy fields, which is what infrastructure are we building, because that's long-lasting and it locks in your emissions pathway, and what innovation processes we got going. And we're not doing either of those well enough. We're not doing enough infrastructure, we're not doing the right kind, and we're not doing enough innovation. So this is really excellent that the World Bank is here. And I do agree, to come back to your question, Isabel, that the focus here on the third of your pillars, which is the political economy, is critical. And it's, we said the same in our New Climate Economy report as this. You can't add on how you do this to your policy package. When you ask the question, have we been focusing on this enough, the people who matter always focus on it. People who actually have to make these decisions are constantly focused on it. As somebody who worked with a prime minister, it is the political economy that is uppermost in your mind all the time. It's about how do you win support for this thing that you'd like to do. And it is, if I may say so, being one, it's the economists who often haven't quite understood the fact that their theory, their pure instruments and so on just don't treat that. So it's very good that the World Bank, as Ilmi says, is, I think to some extent you've always done this because of the kind of work you do, but is really getting into the political economy, the kinds of instruments and approaches that you do. And there's some very useful material in this, and more in the full report. And what I think is interesting here is to what extent we can use the zero carbon understanding and the Paris Agreement this year, and also the Sustainable Development Goals this year, to shift the context in which the political economy is thought about. So if you're a politician, you are incredibly focused on all the political pressures that you feel, and of which, you know, fossil fuel lobbies are the single most biggest and most important. And you know, we really can't have a discussion about political economy without just talking about the power of the fossil fuel lobbies. They produce vast amounts of income for governments, revenue. Huge amounts of revenue comes from these industries. They are really important to fiscal revenues. They are obviously, many of them are nationalised, so they're intertwined with government elites and so on. You can see this in Brazil, where there's a huge corruption scandal going on around fossil industries. So these are very, very powerful, and politicians are thinking about all these things all the time. The question is, what are the countervailing pressures that create a different kind of set of pressures? And one of the reasons that many of us after Copenhagen said we have to start again, we have to do this again, at the point where lots of people said it's failed, you can't do international climate change stuff, the UNFCCC will never come to an agreement, that process has failed, is because what Paris does, and the Sustainable Development Goals up to a point I think will do, is force public attention around climate change and around the low carbon transition in a way that will grab the attention of the publics and of the media and of politicians, and then that changes the context in which you discuss the political economy, because you have a different set of forces. And I think and that's why many of us said we need an international process, because we need Brazil, India, China, the US, Europe, Japan, Russia, every country thinking about this simultaneously, because that's what will then get us a simultaneous action. And so the role of public opinion and of the international context in driving attention to this actually is really important, and that changes the political economy. And you've now got fossil fuel industries feeling up against it a bit, which is really interesting. And that does I think, change things. So the international context makes a huge difference. One more thing to say, though, which I was a little bit surprised in a sense from World Bank report, that there's not more on the poverty aspect of this. What Ilmi's work and ODI's work on zero poverty, zero emissions, which is a lovely capturing of 2 zeros that we need to achieve, different timescales, but 2 zeros, has shown is that you can have zero poverty, zero emissions, but they don't automatically go together. You actually have to go after both objectives. And the interesting thing about the low-carbon development, low-carbon poverty reduction, is that it requires attention to both poverty reduction and zero carbon, in exactly the same way that high-carbon development also needs an attention. And one of the things that the World Bank has tried to do over recent years is focus on development that actually works for the poor. And low-carbon development that works for the poor is 2 objectives still. It isn't simply one. You can do renewable energy in a way that benefits richer people and industries, and you can do high carbon and industry power that does the same. So if you look at India, you've got lots of power produced in the east of the country based on coal, exactly the same regions where the most unserved people, the people who have least access to electricity. That's high carbon. Frankly, if you replaced all those power stations by renewable energy, you could get exactly the same result, which is that you don't distribute the energy to the poor. And so what I think the work that ODI has been doing has been focusing on is the fact that we have to have both these objectives in mind, and you have to think about how your low-carbon strategy gives you poverty reduction in the same way as we tried and largely failed to do in our high-carbon development models in the past.
To just respond to that point, that last point that Michael
Yeah, the last point on poverty, I cannot agree more. In fact, it's not... So first, there is one chapter on this link in the report, but I agree that we could have a bigger focus on this, but the reason is very simple. We're launching on October 5th a report on climate change and poverty, and I wanted to keep a few things to say for the second one, while maybe keeping even a summer break, maybe, who knows. So I completely agree with you that this is what's probably the most important thing, and if you can make a solid case that climate policy contributes to this fantastic goal, which is the eradication of poverty by 2030, which is, would be an unprecedented and a real global achievement, then it gives a lot of weight to also the climate policy itself, if it contributes to this and cannot protect us against a reversal because of some political event or something like this. So we're having a lot of work at the moment on the climate change impact side, showing that climate change will be a very important obstacle to the sustained eradication of poverty, in the sense that our target for poverty eradication is 2030, and I'm pretty confident that whatever we do on climate, we can do it. The problem is what happens beyond 2030 and by the end of the century. So one of the challenges, and we were talking about it with Ilmi over lunch, is in a community which is completely focused on 2030, how do you arrive and tell these people, if you do it the wrong way, you will succeed and you will reach your goal, but it won't be sustained. Then you'll have problem in 2050 and beyond. So you have to reach your goal in a way that's compatible with the long-term sustainability. And that's a difficult thing because you arrive with a completely different timescale, and it's very difficult to integrate the discussion. And in the Climate Change and Poverty report, the biggest challenge we had was to bring the poverty community and the climate change community and to make them talk about the same timescales. And the response like, well, beyond 2030, we have no clue, we have no idea, we don't want to even think about it, it's difficult enough. It's a fair point. It's difficult enough to eradicate poverty by 2030, but I mean, life is what it is, so we have to go beyond that. I wanted just to raise, maybe very quickly.
I also want to give us some
so let's
time
do
for,
this.
so maybe we can take some questions and you can find a chance to weave in the other points that you
Oh, no,
want to
then
weave.
it's going to be okay.
So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. So I will take maybe 3 at a time. So if you could say your name and do ask questions, not just make points. That would be good. We've got a great panel here to give some answers.